You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The day I buried Elias Calvert, it rained like the sky was mourning. Not the gentle spring rain that brings wildflowers, but the kind of cold, driving downpour that cuts through wool coats and settles in your bones like a promise of winter. The funeral director had called twice that morning, voice crackling through the phone static, suggesting we postpone until the weather cleared. I told him no. Grandpa Elias had lived his entire 83 years on his own terms, and I'd be damned if I'd let a Montana thunderstorm dictate how he laid him to rest. 3 people showed up besides me and the preacher. Dr. Hendricks, who'd been making monthly house calls to the homestead for the past decade, stood hunched under a black umbrella that fought a losing battle against the wind. His face carried the haunted expression of a man who'd seen too much during those visits, though he'd never spoken about what exactly had driven my grandfather to barricade himself in that remote house like he was expecting a siege. Mrs. Patterson from the general store in town had made the 30-mile drive, ostensibly to pay respects, but more likely out of curiosity about the hermit who'd ordered strange supplies through the mail for 20 years. Salt by the 100-pound bag, iron filings, wooden bullets hand-carved from specific tree species, books on folklore and demonology shipped from universities across the country. She'd filled those orders without question, but I could see the speculation in her weathered eyes as she watched us lower the coffin into muddy ground. Father Mackenzie mumbled through prayers for a man he had never met, reading from water-stained pages while rain dripped steadily from the brim of his black hat. His voice carried uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely convinced the standard Catholic funeral rites would suffice for whatever Elias Calvert had been in life. The few townspeople who'd encountered my grandfather in recent years described him as a man carrying invisible weight, always glancing over his shoulder like something was following him through shadows that fell wrong. I inherited everything by default. The last heir to a family tree that had been systematically pruned by tragedy. My mother, Elias's only daughter, had died in a car accident when I was 12. Black ice on a mountain road that everyone swore had been clear an hour earlier. Dad followed her 6 years later, victim of what the doctors called a heart attack, but what looked more like a man who'd simply given up on breathing. That left me, Thorne Calvert, 32 years old, with a construction business hanging on by financial threads and no real anchors keeping me tethered to city life. The lawyer, a nervous man named Whitmore who'd driven up from Billings, handed me a ring of keys that felt heavier than their size suggested, and a manila envelope containing the deed to 200 acres of wilderness that stretched into the Absaroka Mountains. The homestead sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through pine forests thick enough to swallow daylight, across 3 separate creek beds, and past rock formations that looked like frozen screams against the sky. Your grandfather was very specific about the inheritance terms, Whitmore said, fidgeting with his briefcase latches. The property cannot be sold for 5 years after his death. He wanted to ensure you'd have time to, and I quote, understand the responsibilities that come with the Calvert name. The lawyer's eyes never quite met mine when he said it, as if repeating those words made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. The nearest neighbour lived 15 miles away through forest that cell phone towers had never penetrated. Satellite internet was theoretically possible, but Elias had never bothered with installation. He'd lived his final decades in deliberate isolation, connected to the outside world only through mail-order deliveries and the occasional visit from Dr. Hendricks, who'd grown increasingly reluctant to make those house calls as the years passed. Real estate developers had started circling before the funeral dirt settled, leaving voicemails about the property's potential for hunting lodges or executive retreats. But Whitmore's revelation about the 5-year restriction meant I had time to understand what I'd inherited before making any permanent decisions. First, though, I needed to learn what kind of man my grandfather had really been, and why he'd chosen to spend his final years like a general preparing for a war that nobody else could see. The house itself was built like a fortress disguised as a homestead. Thick timber walls that could stop rifle rounds, a stone foundation anchored deep enough to survive earthquakes, windows positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across all approaches. Every door had multiple deadbolts, and steel shutters could be dropped over the windows at a moment's notice. Motion sensors and floodlights surrounded the property in concentric rings, powered by a generator system that could run for months without refueling. Inside, the main floor revealed a man who'd lived in constant expectation of attack. The living room centered on a massive stone fireplace, surrounded by bookshelves that held an eclectic mix of hunting magazines, survivalist manuals, and texts on folklore from cultures around the world. Mythology, demonology, cryptozoology, anthropological studies of indigenous legends, subjects that seemed oddly academic for a man who'd spent his life in practical pursuits. The gun cabinet in the corner held an arsenal that went far beyond normal hunting needs. Military surplus rifles, tactical shotguns, handguns in calibers designed to stop charging bears. But mixed among the conventional weapons were stranger items. Crossbows with hand-carved bolts, rifles modified to fire wooden ammunition, blessed silver bullets in boxes labelled with dates and locations going back decades. It was the kitchen that first hinted at deeper mysteries. Alongside normal spices and preserved foods, the pantry shelves groaned under the weight of substances I couldn't identify. Mason jars filled with dried herbs that gave off acrid medicinal smells. Bottles of water with handwritten labels indicating they'd been collected from specific locations. Yellowstone hot springs, summer solstice 1987, Lake Superior stormwater, October 31st, 1992, Colorado River flood, spring equinox 2003. Salt was stored not in normal kitchen containers but in military surplus ammunition boxes, dozens of pounds stacked like preparations for a siege. Iron filings filled coffee cans that lined an entire wall, each labelled with cryptic notations about purity levels and source locations. Everything suggested a man preparing for warfare against enemies that required very specific ammunition. But it was the root cellar that held the real secrets. The wooden steps creaked ominously as I descended into cool, musty darkness that smelled of earth and something else. Something organic and unsettling that I couldn't identify. Preserved foods lined the walls in neat rows, enough supplies to survive a nuclear winter, but behind the last rack of mason jars, wedged into a corner like someone had tried to hide it from casual discovery, I found an iron trunk secured with chains thick enough to anchor a ship. The lock had long since surrendered to Montana weather, leaving only rust stains and metal fragments that turned my fingers orange when I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that carried scents of gun oil, old blood, and something else that made my sinuses burn, lay a journal bound in cracked leather. The cover was scarred with deep gouges that looked deliberately inflicted, as if something with very large claws had tried to rip it apart in frustrated rage. Dark stains discoloured the leather in irregular patterns that might have been blood or other bodily fluids. When I opened it carefully, loose pages fluttered out like dying autumn leaves, each one covered in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The earliest entries were dated 43 years ago, written when Elias would have been barely 40 years old. March 12, 1982. Investigated livestock killings near Glacier National Park. Sheriff Jameson insists it's wolves, but wolves don't drain every drop of blood from a 2,000-pound bull and leave the meat completely untouched. Found tracks in the mud that don't match anything in Peterson's field guide. 4 distinct toes instead of 5, but definitely bipedal when it wants to be. Measured stride length suggests something nearly 8 feet tall when fully upright. Something is hunting in these mountains, and it doesn't appear in any natural history textbook. I sat on the cellar floor reading by the light of a bare bulb that cast harsh shadows across stone walls. Page after page revealed a hidden world that had existed parallel to normal life. A shadow realm populated by creatures that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. My grandfather hadn't just been a hunter, he'd been hunting things that lived in the spaces between legend and nightmare, documenting encounters that would have destroyed most people's sanity. April 7th, 1982. Successful tracking of what locals call the Bone Shepherd led me to cave systems west of Reno. Found skeletal remains of at least 20 people arranged in perfect geometric circles sorted by bone type and apparent age at death. The creature itself stands nearly 8 feet tall when upright, but moves with disturbing fluidity on all fours like a predator built for pursuit. Bone protrusions from skull and spine suggest it's been collecting calcium from its victims, incorporating their remains into its own body structure through some process I don't understand. Managed to wound it severely with blessed silver shot blessed by 3 different religious traditions, but couldn't confirm a kill. It retreated deeper into the cave system, and I wasn't fool enough to follow it into underground darkness where it held every advantage. Each entry was more disturbing than the previous one. Detailed accounts of encounters across North America, each creature more terrifying and impossible than what came before. The weeping stag of Oregon's coastal forests, which mimicked the cries of lost children with such perfection that search parties would follow the sounds deep into old-growth timber where they were never seen again. Investigators would find their abandoned equipment days later, scattered in perfect circles around trees that bled sap the color of human blood. The mudwalker of Louisiana bayous, something that emerged from swamp waters during hurricane seasons, leaving trails of smoldering footprints that killed vegetation for years afterward and caused the ground itself to remain unnaturally warm. Local Creole communities had legends about it going back centuries, describing it as punishment for those who disrespected the natural balance, but they had never seen it up close like my grandfather had. Pressed between the journal pages were samples that defied rational explanation. Scales that shifted colour depending on the angle of light, remaining warm to the touch despite decades of storage in the cool cellar. Leaves that stayed green and flexible, though they were obviously ancient, seeming to pulse with their own internal rhythm when I held them up to the light. A tuft of fur that felt almost alive under my fingertips, appearing to move when I wasn't looking directly at it, carrying a scent that reminded me of thunderstorms and old graves. But it was my grandfather's detailed sketches that truly brought these impossible creatures to life. He'd possessed considerable artistic skill, and his drawings captured not just the physical appearance of these beings, but something of their malevolent essence, their fundamental wrongness in the natural order. The Bone Shepherd crouched over a fresh kill, its elongated skull crowned with spikes of collected human bone that had somehow fused with its own anatomy. The weeping stag standing at the edge of a moonlit clearing, its 2 human eyes reflecting intelligence and hunger in equal measure, while its mouth opened to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. Each sketch was accompanied by detailed notes about hunting patterns, territorial behaviors, apparent intelligence levels, and most importantly, weaknesses that could be exploited. Iron caused burns, Salt created barriers they wouldn't cross. Certain religious symbols provided protection, though effectiveness varied based on the faith and conviction of the person wielding them. Silver bullets worked, but only if blessed by genuine religious authorities and fired with specific intentions. As I read deeper into the journal, the tone began to change subtly. The earlier entries had maintained a clinical, almost scientific approach to documenting these encounters. My grandfather wrote like a researcher cataloguing new species, focusing on observable behaviours and measurable physical characteristics, but gradually a sense of mounting dread crept into his prose, a growing awareness that he was dealing with forces that operated according to rules beyond human comprehension. September 15th, 1985. The creatures are connected somehow. Found identical cave paintings at 3 separate sites, Wyoming, Nevada, and Oregon, that predate any known human habitation in those regions. The symbols carved into stone formations match drawings I found in medieval manuscripts and indigenous oral traditions from tribes that were never in contact with each other. These things aren't random monsters. They're part of something larger, something organized, something that's been watching humanity for far longer than we've been watching them. The entries began to focus increasingly on evidence that these creatures were studying him as intensively as he was studying them. Tracks appeared around the homestead with disturbing regularity. Equipment went missing from his truck during hunting expeditions, only to be found days later, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and deliberate message sending. Most unsettling of all, locals began reporting a tall, pale figure asking questions about Elias Calvert in towns he'd never visited. June 8th, 1987. It's been following me for 3 months now. The Pale Watcher. First spotted it outside a remote cabin in Glacier National Park, just standing at the tree line like some malevolent scarecrow left by a farmer who'd given up on protecting his crops. Perfectly motionless for hours, never blinking, never shifting position, just watching with the infinite patience of something that had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to wait. Sarah was my grandmother, though she'd died when I was only 5 years old. I remembered her as a kind woman who smelled of lavender soap and baked cookies shaped like farm animals, who sang off-key lullabies and told bedtime stories about brave knights and talking animals. But the journal entries revealed she'd been deliberately kept away from the homestead during her final years of life, though she'd apparently never understood why her husband had suddenly become so protective and paranoid. August 12th, 1987. Completed construction of the sanctuary deep in the North Woods. Reinforced cabin with steel beams salvaged from a demolished factory. Walls thick enough to stop rifle fire and hurricane winds. Surrounded the entire clearing with protective barriers that took me 6 months to properly install. Iron stakes driven 8 feet into the earth and anchored with concrete. Salt lines that require monthly renewal. Symbols carved into standing stones that I copied from texts older than Christianity. My grandfather's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the years progressed in the journal. What had started as neat, precise script suitable for scientific documentation devolved into sharp, angular letters that looked like they'd been carved into the paper with desperate urgency. The ink changed colours frequently, as if he'd been writing with whatever was available during moments of crisis, sometimes black ink, sometimes blue, occasionally what looked suspiciously like dried blood. October 30th, 1991. It knows my name now. Heard it calling from the darkness last night. Voice like stones grinding together in the bottom of a dry riverbed. But it wasn't just saying Elias. In that grinding, inhuman tone, it used the inflections my mother used when she was angry. The specific ways she'd stretch out the syllables when I'd tracked mud through her kitchen. But my mother has been dead for 15 years. And there's no way this thing could know those intimate details unless it's been inside my head somehow. The physical descriptions of the Pale Watcher were particularly detailed and disturbing. According to my grandfather's increasingly frantic notes, it stood nearly 9 feet tall when fully upright, but its proportions were fundamentally wrong for something that size. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it on some cosmic torture device until it barely resembled its original shape. Its skin was described as the colour and texture of old parchment, stretched so tight over the underlying bone structure that every ridge and hollow was clearly visible. Veins showed through like dark rivers under ice, and when it moved, you could hear joints popping and tendons creaking like old leather. But it was the face that haunted my grandfather's dreams and filled page after page with increasingly desperate attempts to capture its wrongness in words. Partially human, but fundamentally alien, with a jaw that could unhinge like a serpent's to reveal rows of teeth that belonged in no earthly creature's mouth. The eyes reflected light like an animal's, glowing pale gold in darkness, and they never blinked. Never looked away once they fixed on their target. Some primitive part of the human brain recognized it as predator, as something designed specifically to hunt people, and reacted with terror that bypassed rational thought entirely. December 24th, 1995. Christmas Eve. And I'm writing this by candlelight while something circles my house in the darkness outside. Sarah used to love Christmas more than any other time of year. She'd spend weeks decorating every room, baking enough cookies to feed half the county, preparing gifts for relatives we barely saw. Now she's been gone 3 years, and I'm alone with this thing that won't let me rest, won't let me grieve, won't let me have a single night's peaceful sleep. It's learning about my family. Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned a tall stranger who came by asking detailed questions about mail deliveries to the homestead, wanting to know about visitors, about family members who might come to stay for holidays. The description she gave made my blood freeze. It's building a complete picture of everyone I care about, everyone whose voice it might eventually use against me. I realized with growing horror that the stranger had been asking about me specifically, gathering information about the grandson who might someday inherit the Calvert family's dark legacy. January 15th, 1998. 20 years now since this nightmare began, and I finally understand the true scope of what I'm facing. The Pale Watcher isn't just a predator. It's a collector of human experience. Every person it kills becomes part of it somehow. Not just their physical remains, but their memories, their knowledge, their emotional connections to the living world. It's been building a vast catalogue of human experience, and it uses that knowledge to hunt more effectively, to understand its prey's weaknesses and exploit them with surgical precision. The journal entries became increasingly sparse as years passed, sometimes with 6 months or more between notations. When they did appear, they spoke of mounting paranoia and increasingly desperate defensive measures. My grandfather had transformed the homestead into a fortress, but he was fighting an enemy that could wait decades for a single moment of weakness. July 4th, 2003. Independence Day. Ironic, since I haven't felt truly free in 20 years. Reinforced the sanctuary again using techniques I learned from military engineering manuals. Triple layered the iron plating, added redundant generator systems, stockpiled enough supplies to survive a year-long siege if necessary. The thing hasn't shown itself directly in over 18 months, but I can feel it out there in the darkness, patient as geological time itself, waiting for me to make a mistake. November 11th, 2008. Veterans Day. Appropriate, since I've been fighting this war for most of my adult life, and I'm starting to lose. The protective barriers around the sanctuary are failing, despite constant maintenance. The iron stakes show signs of corrosion that shouldn't be possible, given their composition and the protective coatings I applied. The salt lines need renewal, every 2 weeks now instead of monthly. The thing is testing my defenses constantly, probing for weaknesses, learning from each attempted breach. The final dated entries were barely legible, written with hands that shook so badly the ink created abstract patterns across yellowed pages. October 15th, 2012. It spoke to me last night using my father's voice. Not the grinding, inhuman tone I'd grown accustomed to over the decades, but perfect mimicry of the man who raised me after my mother died in childbirth. The old man has been dead for 25 years, but it captured every nuance. The slight stutter he developed after his stroke, the way he'd clear his throat before saying something important, even the specific words of affection he'd use when he was proud of me. October 20th, 2012. Haven't slept properly in 6 days. Every time I close my eyes, I hear voices of people I've loved, people I've lost. All of them calling my name from the darkness beyond my windows. It knows everything about me now. Every fear, every regret, every moment of weakness from 8 decades of living. But it still hasn't attacked directly. Still playing with its food, extracting every possible moment of terror before the final feast. October 28th, 2012. This has to be the final entry. I can't let this continue. The thing is learning about Thorne now, asking questions in town, following paper trails that lead directly to my grandson's doorstep. Everything I've done to protect my family has been for nothing if it reaches him. Going into the woods tonight. One way or another, this ends. If I can't kill it, maybe I can at least lead it away from anyone else I care about. But there was one more page hidden behind the journal's back cover and written in different ink that looked fresh compared to the faded entries surrounding it. I lied about this being the end, couldn't go through with a direct confrontation. The Pale Watcher isn't something you can kill with bullets or blades, no matter how blessed or specifically prepared they might be. It's older than human civilization, patient as erosion, intelligent in ways that make our brightest scientists look like children playing with finger paints. If I die fighting it directly, it will absorb everything I know about my family. Thorne's address, his habits, his friends, his weaknesses, his fears. But I found something else in the old texts, something the previous hunters never tried. Because it requires a different kind of sacrifice. The binding ritual. If I can lure it into the cage at the sanctuary, if I can maintain the containment long enough, maybe I can starve it of the fear it feeds on. Maybe I can trap it the way it's been trapping me for 30 years. If Thorne finds this journal, he needs to know I tried everything to protect him. Don't come looking for my body, boy. Burn these pages and never return to these woods. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, and some family legacies are better ended than continued. The handwriting dissolved into illegible scrawls after that, as if written during moments of extreme stress or mortal terror. Dark stains covered the bottom portion of the page, stains that looked suspiciously like blood, mixed with something else, something that made the paper feel warm, to the touch even in the cool cellar. I realized I'd been sitting in that underground chamber for hours while daylight died above me. The house settled and creaked in the evening wind, every sound amplified by the stone walls until normal house noises became potential threats. I climbed the wooden stairs with the journal clutched against my chest, feeling irrationally like something was watching me from the shadows, though I knew I was alone. Sleep was impossible that first night. I sat at the kitchen table under harsh fluorescent light, studying the crude maps my grandfather had sketched in the journal's margins. The sanctuary was marked with a small X, approximately 3 miles north of the homestead through what the topographical annotations indicated was extremely challenging terrain. Dotted lines showed game trails, and warnings filled every available space in tiny, precise script. Steep ravine, 200 feet drop, no safe crossing after spring melt, active bear den, avoid June through August, cell service ends at ridgeline, GPS unreliable, due to magnetic anomalies. Additional notes covered every margin, recommended equipment lists, seasonal variations in creature activity, optimal times for travel based on lunar phases and weather patterns. My grandfather had turned cryptid hunting into an exact science, approaching each encounter with the methodical precision of a military campaign. But all that preparation hadn't saved him in the end. At dawn, I made a decision that would change my life forever. The rational part of my mind insisted this was elaborate delusion, the paranoid fantasies of an old man who'd spent too many years alone in the wilderness with only his fears for company. But the evidence was compelling. The physical samples, the detailed sketches that captured impossible anatomical features, the internal consistency of 40 years worth of documentation. Either my grandfather had been the most dedicated and creative fantasist in human history, or he'd been documenting something genuinely supernatural. Given the defensive preparations around the homestead, the modified weapons, the industrial quantities of protective materials, I was starting to believe the latter explanation. I needed to see this sanctuary for myself. I needed to understand what had happened to the last member of my family who'd tried to protect me from something I didn't even know existed. I spent the morning packing carefully, following my grandfather's detailed supply recommendations. Water purification tablets rated for biological contamination, high-energy food bars that wouldn't spoil in temperature extremes, first aid supplies including trauma dressings and emergency antibiotics, waterproof matches, emergency blankets, signalling devices that would work even without cell coverage. From the gun cabinet, I selected a lever-action rifle in .45, 70 caliber, a round powerful enough to stop charging grizzly bears. The ammunition box contained cartridges that had been opened and reloaded with something other than standard bullets, wooden projectiles carved from what looked like rowan wood, inscribed with symbols that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them directly. The forest behind the homestead was thick with pine and birch that grew so densely they blocked most sunlight from reaching the forest floor. Following my grandfather's hand-drawn maps, I hiked north through increasingly difficult terrain, where game trails were narrow, overgrown, and clearly unused by anything larger than deer for many years. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps on decades of accumulated pine needles. After 3 hours of challenging hiking that left me drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air, the sanctuary appeared in a small clearing like something from a military engineering manual. The cabin itself was built like a bunker designed to withstand artillery bombardment. Thick log walls reinforced with steel plating, narrow windows positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire in every direction, a metal roof that looked capable of stopping anything short of armor-piercing rounds. The entire structure was surrounded by concentric rings of iron stakes driven deep into the earth, creating defensive barriers that extended 50 feet in every direction. Some stakes were as thick as fence posts, others thin as rebar, all arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate for more than a few seconds. Salt lines were still clearly visible, despite decades of Montana weather, forming complex geometric designs around the protective stakes that reminded me of circuit board layouts or ritual magic diagrams. At the cardinal compass points, standing stones had been erected and carved with symbols from multiple traditions: Christian crosses, Jewish stars, Islamic crescents, Buddhist wheels, Norse runes, and dozens of other markings I couldn't identify. The overall effect was less like a hunting cabin and more like a fortress designed specifically to keep demons at bay. Inside, the sanctuary revealed the full scope of my grandfather's obsession. The walls were lined with modified hunting equipment that looked like props from a monster movie. Rifles with hand-carved wooden bullets inscribed with microscopic symbols. Crossbow bolts tipped with silver points that had been blessed by religious authorities from 6 different faiths. Glass bottles filled with various powders and liquids, each labelled in my grandfather's meticulous handwriting with ingredients and preparation dates. Blessed salt from St. Patrick's Cathedral, consecrated December 25th, 1987. Silver filings from pre-1964 coins, purified with holy water from Lourdes, rowan ash from Scottish Highlands, collected during summer solstice. Protective charms from dozens of different cultures hung from the rafters like some insane mobile created by a comparative religion professor with too much time and not enough sanity. Christian crosses of various denominations shared space with Native American dream catchers, Egyptian ankhs, Norse runestones, Hindu symbols, and protective devices from traditions I couldn't begin to identify. It was the collection of a man who'd tried everything in his desperate search for something that would provide genuine protection against forces beyond human understanding. But dominating the room's centre like some medieval torture device was a massive steel cage with bars as thick as my wrist. The bars had been bent outward from within, twisted like soft metal by something possessing incredible strength. Metal stress patterns indicated the force had been applied gradually over time, rather than in a single violent outburst. Whatever had been contained there had worked patiently at its prison until it achieved freedom. The floor around the cage was stained dark with substances that might have been blood or other bodily fluids. Deep claw marks scored the wooden walls in patterns that suggested something large had paced frantically within the confined space, wearing grooves in timber that would have resisted chainsaw cuts. More disturbing were the symbols carved into the walls, at regular intervals, the same protective markings I'd seen on the standing stones outside, but these appeared to have been cut from the inside of the cabin, as if whatever had been imprisoned had been trying to neutralize the very barriers designed to contain it. A folding table near the cage held scattered research materials that painted a picture of scholarly obsession turned deadly serious. Newspaper clippings about missing persons cases across the western United States, carefully organized by date and location. Police reports about unexplained animal attacks, with particular attention to cases involving drained blood and arranged body parts. Academic papers downloaded from university libraries about folklore traditions, comparative mythology, and anthropological studies of indigenous legends. Photographs showed crime scenes and forensic evidence that made my stomach clench with nausea. Bodies arranged in ritualistic patterns, livestock drained of blood but left otherwise untouched, human footprints that gradually transformed into something else over the course of several miles. One particularly disturbing image showed a family of 4 found in their camping tent, positioned as if they'd died peacefully in their sleep, but with expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces. But it was a series of photographs showing tracks in dried mud that truly captured my attention. They started as normal human footprints, size 12 boots with distinctive wear patterns, but over the course of several images, the tracks began to change. The heel marks grew longer, the toe impressions deeper and more widely spaced. By the final photograph, what pressed into the mud was almost human, but elongated, with deep claw marks at the end of each digit and a stride length that indicated something nearly 8 feet tall. In the margin, my grandfather had written, in his careful script, Pale Watcher Transformation Sequence. Confirmed sighting near Glacier National Park, August 15th, 1987. Note gradual morphology. Change over 2.3 mile tracking distance. Subject appears capable of moderate shapeshifting, possibly explaining conflicting witness descriptions. As I studied the accumulated evidence of my grandfather's decades-long investigation, daylight began to fade outside the cabin's reinforced windows. I'd planned to complete the return hike before dark, but the trail would take at least 3 hours to navigate safely, and I'd certainly lose my way in darkness that fell like a curtain in the deep forest. Better to spend one night in the sanctuary and leave at first light. especially since this fortress had been specifically designed to provide protection against the very entity that had stalked my grandfather to his death. I barricaded the heavy door with the folding table and lit several oil lanterns that hung from hooks around the room. By flickering yellow light that created dancing shadows on the log walls, I continued reading through my grandfather's research notes and journal entries. The picture they painted was of a man slowly consumed by an obsession that had cost him everything normal life had to offer: his wife's companionship, his family's closeness, his own peace of mind. The Pale Watcher exhibits behavioral patterns unlike any known predator in the fossil record or current ecosystem. One typed report read, stamped with dates from the 1990s. Traditional hunting methodology assumes creatures kill for sustenance, territorial advantage, or reproductive necessity. This entity appears motivated by psychological factors that suggest sapient intelligence and emotional satisfaction derived from the hunting process itself. It demonstrates clear enjoyment of inspiring terror, of the extended stalking period that precedes actual predation, of the psychological torment that results from prolonged pursuit without resolution. Another note, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as my grandfather's health declined. Local Native American tribes from 6 different linguistic families all have legends about the Hollow One, though they were separated by thousands of miles and had no historical contact with each other. They describe it as divine punishment for those who take more from the natural world than they can give back, but also as something that chooses its victims based on criteria we don't understand. Not random predation, deliberate selection based on some quality it recognizes and desires. Around midnight, I heard the first sounds from outside the cabin that made every primitive instinct in my body scream warnings about immediate danger. Heavy footsteps circled the clearing with mechanical precision just beyond the range of lamplight filtering through the narrow windows. The footsteps were too measured, too deliberate to be from any natural animal. They paused at regular intervals, as if whatever was out there was methodically testing the defensive perimeter my grandfather had spent decades perfecting. I pressed my face to one of the reinforced windows and tried to see past the salt circles into the darkness beyond. For long minutes that felt like hours, nothing moved, except wind-stirred branches casting shifting shadows in the pale moonlight. Then, at the very edge of the clearing, where forest darkness swallowed everything in absolute black, I saw a pale shape standing perfectly motionless between 2 towering pine trees. It was tall, much taller than any human being had a right to be, and seemed to be studying the cabin with the patient attention of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Even at that distance, even in the uncertain light, I could see it was fundamentally wrong, in ways that bypassed rational analysis and triggered genetic memories of things that hunted our ancestors in the African night. The proportions were impossible. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head positioned at an angle that suggested the neck could rotate much further than human anatomy allowed. But it was the absolute stillness of its posture that truly disturbed me. No living creature stood that motionless for that long. Even trees swayed in the wind, but this thing remained frozen like a statue carved from bone and shadow. Thorne. My name drifted through the night air, spoken in a voice like stones grinding together in the bottom of a dry creek bed. The pale shape had not moved, had not opened what might have been a mouth, but somehow I knew the sound had originated from it with absolute certainty that bypassed rational thought. Thorne Calvert. This time the voice was clearer, though still fundamentally wrong in ways that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. It knew my full name, which meant it had been studying me, learning about my life, my habits, my connections to the living world. According to the journal entries, that level of personal knowledge was the prelude to a hunting campaign that could last decades. I backed away from the window and sat heavily at the research table, the journal open before me to my grandfather's most desperate final entries. November 15th, 2012. It spoke my name last night for the first time in 25 years of stalking. Called to me in perfect mimicry of my father's voice, using the exact intonation he'd use when he was proud of something I'd accomplished. But my father has been dead since 1987, and there's no way this thing could know those intimate details of our relationship, unless it's been accessing my memories somehow, reading my thoughts like pages in a book. The Pale Watcher wants me to come outside to step beyond the protection of the barriers I've spent decades perfecting. It's patient as erosion itself, willing to wait until age or illness or simple exhaustion causes me to lower my guard for just one critical moment, but I can't give it what it wants. Too much depends on maintaining these defenses, on keeping it contained to this remote location where it can't reach anyone else I care about. November 20th, 2012. Found evidence it's been to town again, asking more detailed questions about mail deliveries, about family members who might visit the homestead for holidays. Mrs. Patterson described the same tall stranger, but this time it knew specific details about my grandson, Thorne's construction business, his financial troubles, even the address of his apartment in Billings. It's building a complete psychological profile of everyone I love, everyone whose voice and mannerisms it might eventually use against me. The hunt has become deeply personal now. This isn't just about feeding or territorial behavior anymore. The thing is enjoying my terror, savoring every sleepless night, every moment of paranoid vigilance. It feeds on fear as much as flesh, and I've been providing a banquet for over 30 years. November 22nd, 2012, final entry. Can't let this continue. Every day I remain alive gives it more time to learn about my family, to study Thorne's patterns and vulnerabilities. If I die of old age, it will have absorbed decades worth of accumulated knowledge about everyone I care about. If I try to fight it directly and fail, it will consume my memories and know everything instantly. There has to be another option. There has to be a way to end this without giving it what it wants. But the hidden page behind the back cover told a different story, written in ink, that still looked wet compared to the faded entries surrounding it. Found another way. The old texts speak of binding rituals that use the creature's own hunger against it. Not killing, that's impossible with something this ancient, but imprisonment. If I can lure it into the cage using myself as bait, if I can maintain the binding long enough, maybe I can starve it of the fear it feeds on. Maybe I can trap it the way it's been trapping me. The ritual requires blood sacrifice. Not death, but a permanent offering that links the victim to the binding. I've prepared everything. The cage has been inscribed with symbols from every protective tradition I could research. The iron stakes form a containment grid that should hold even something with its strength. If this works, Thorne will never need to know about any of this. If it fails... If Thorne finds this journal, he needs to understand I tried everything to protect him. Don't come looking for my body, boy. Burn these pages and never return to these woods. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, and some family legacies should die with the men who created them. Outside, the footsteps resumed their patient circuit of the clearing, but now they were accompanied by voices that made my heart pound with recognition and terror. Soft, familiar tones drifted through the reinforced walls like smoke through cracks in stone. "Thorne, honey, is that you in there?" My breath caught in my throat. That was my mother's voice, exactly as I remembered it from childhood. The same gentle cadence she'd used when calling me in for dinner. The same slight Montana accent that marked her as the lifetime resident of Big Sky country. But my mother had been dead for 20 years, killed in a car accident on black ice that everyone swore hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Come outside, sweetie. Mummy's been waiting so long to see you again." "Don't listen to her, son." My father's voice joined the first, gruff and authoritative in the way I remembered from my teenage years, when he'd been struggling with grief and alcohol. "She's not real, Thorne. None of this is real. Just come on out and we'll explain everything, get you back home where you belong." The voices multiplied with terrifying speed, each one perfect in its mimicry of people who had mattered to me at different points in my life. My grandfather's familiar tone, now patient and concerned, rather than the frantic urgency of his final journal entries. Grandmother Sarah singing lullabies I hadn't heard since early childhood, in a voice that carried the warmth of fresh-baked cookies and unconditional love. Friends from elementary school, neighbours from various apartments I'd rented, co-workers from construction jobs going back years. Even my high school girlfriend, using the pet name she'd called me during our brief teenage romance. Every voice was perfect, capturing not just the sound but the emotional resonance, the personal history between us, the intimate knowledge that only comes from genuine relationships. The thing outside had access to my memories somehow, was using my own past as ammunition against my sanity. It knew about conversations that had taken place in private, jokes that only specific people would understand, moments of vulnerability that I'd never shared with anyone else. "We've been waiting for you, Thorne." This was Father Mackenzie from the funeral, though his tone carried an eagerness that seemed wrong, coming from a man of the cloth. "Join us. We're all here together now. Everyone who ever mattered to you, everyone who ever cared about you. Don't you want to see us again?" The voices grew louder, more insistent, overlapping and blending together until they became a cacophony of familiar tones, all saying variations of the same thing. "Come outside, Thorne. Step beyond the barriers. Join your family. We've been waiting so long for you to come home." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to originate from inside the cabin now. Impossible as that should have been, given the thick walls and reinforced construction. The oil lamps flickered as if responding to some invisible presence, casting dancing shadows that took on the suggestion of human forms, beckoning me towards the barricaded door. "Don't be afraid, grandson." My grandfather's voice, warm and reassuring, in a way I'd never heard during his actual lifetime. I found a way to stop it. The binding worked perfectly. It's trapped now, powerless, unable to hurt anyone ever again. Safe to come outside and see for yourself. But I'd read the journal entries carefully. I knew my grandfather's final attempt had failed, that he died alone in these woods while the Pale Watcher watched and learned from his terror. The thing was using his voice now, wearing his identity like a comfortable disguise, trying to convince me that salvation lay just beyond the protective barriers. I grabbed one of the modified rifles from the wall rack and checked the chamber with hands that shook despite my efforts to remain calm. The bullets were carved from pale rowan wood, inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I tried to focus on them directly. Whatever these projectiles were, my grandfather had believed they could harm entities that laughed at conventional weapons. The voices continued their psychological assault throughout the long night, sometimes speaking individually, with specific memories that only the real people could have possessed, other times merging into a chorus of beloved dead, all pleading for me to abandon the cabin's protection and embrace them in the darkness outside. They knew about my father's drinking problem that he'd tried so hard to hide. They referenced conversations I'd had with my mother, about my future plans, discussions that had taken place in private moments when no one else was listening. They sang songs my grandmother had hummed while cooking, using the exact off-key pitch that had made them endearing rather than musical. But gradually, as dawn approached, I began to notice inconsistencies. Small details that were almost right but not quite perfect. My mother called me sweetie repeatedly, but she'd actually preferred honey. My father's concern sounded genuine, but he'd never been the type to explain problems. He'd been more likely to demand immediate action, without justification. The voices were incredibly accurate, but they lacked the true emotional depth that comes from genuine human personality. Dawn came slowly, the eastern sky lightening by degrees until full sunlight penetrated the forest canopy and banished the shadows that had seemed so threatening during the night hours. By the time I felt confident enough to peer through the reinforced windows, the clearing appeared completely normal. Birds sang in the surrounding trees for the first time since I'd arrived. A gentle breeze stirred the pine branches in patterns that looked natural rather than deliberately ominous. No sign remained of the previous night's supernatural assault, but I could feel eyes watching me as I packed my supplies and prepared to leave the sanctuary. Something was still out there, still patient, still waiting for me to make a mistake that would put me within its reach. The return hike to the homestead passed without obvious incident, though I frequently felt like I was being followed by something that stayed just beyond the range of normal perception. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources when glimpsed in peripheral vision. Twice I spun around, convinced I'd heard footsteps on the trail behind me, only to find empty forest that held its breath like a guilty child caught in mischief. At the house, I spent the afternoon loading everything into my truck with methodical precision. The journal, the photographs, all of my grandfather's research materials, everything went into cardboard boxes that I secured in the vehicle's cargo bed. I needed time away from this place, space to process what I'd learned, and decide how to proceed with knowledge that could destroy my sanity if I dwelt on it too long. But as I drove down the winding gravel road toward what passed for civilization in rural Montana, movement in my rearview mirror caught my attention. At the very edge of the tree line, barely visible against the dark pine trunks, a tall, pale figure stood perfectly motionless. It made no attempt to follow or pursue, simply watched my truck disappear around the first bend with the infinite patience of something that had waited 40 years and could wait 40 more without growing restless. The pale watcher had learned my scent from the journal pages, just as my grandfather had warned in his notes. Reading his accounts had marked me somehow, connected me to whatever cosmic horror he'd spent his adult life trying to contain. I was part of the hunt now, whether I wanted to be or not, inheritor of a family legacy written in blood and terror. During the 3-hour drive back to Billings, my cell phone gradually regained signal strength and began buzzing with notifications that made my blood run cold. 7 voicemails from my sister Linda in Denver, though I was an only child and had never had a sister. 4 text messages from my college roommate Danny asking when I was coming home, though I'd lived alone throughout university and never had a roommate named Danny. Missed calls from relatives I'd never heard of, friends I'd never made, co-workers from jobs I'd never held, all asking why I hadn't been in touch, all wondering when I was coming to visit, all using intimate details about my life that they shouldn't have known. The Pale Watcher was already reaching into my world, using modern technology to map my social connections, to learn the names and relationships it would need to hunt me effectively. Just like it had done with my grandfather decades earlier, it was playing an extremely long game, gathering intelligence for a campaign that might last years or even decades. But patience worked both ways. If it wanted to hunt me, it would discover I was far from defenseless prey. I spent the next 3 weeks in the city's main library, researching everything I could find about entities similar to the Pale Watcher. Folklore from indigenous cultures around the world, medieval accounts of demons and revenants, modern cryptozoology, reports that had been dismissed by mainstream science but showed disturbing similarities to my grandfather's experiences. The picture that emerged was of something genuinely ancient, a predator that had been stalking humanity since before recorded history began. Different cultures had different names for it: the Hollow One, the Pale Death, the Long Walker, the fear eater, but the core characteristics remained consistent across continents and centuries. But the research also revealed something encouraging. The creature wasn't invincible. Historical accounts described successful bindings, cases where similar entities had been trapped or destroyed by people who understood their true nature and possessed the courage to take direct action. My grandfather had been close to a working solution when the Pale Watcher finally claimed him. More importantly, I learned the creature's apparent omniscience was actually a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. It didn't truly read minds. It was incredibly skilled at cold reading, at picking up subtle behavioral cues and using them to make educated guesses about personal details. The voice mimicry was impressive but not perfect, especially when it tried to sustain long conversations rather than brief psychological attacks. Its greatest weapon was fear itself. The more terrified its victims became, the more they revealed about themselves through unconscious body language and verbal slips. Fear made people predictable, made them react in ways that provided additional information for future psychological assaults. But someone who understood the mechanism could potentially turn that weapon back against the creature itself. I returned to the homestead after a month of intensive preparation, but this time I came equipped for war rather than investigation. Military surplus equipment purchased through legitimate dealers who didn't ask too many questions about why a civilian needed night vision goggles and tactical communications gear. Industrial quantities of iron and salt from construction suppliers who were happy to deliver to remote locations for the right price. Books on protective ward construction from occult dealers who operated through encrypted websites, texts on binding rituals from university libraries that required special permission to access, weapon modification guides from forums where people discussed monster hunting as if it were a legitimate hobby rather than elaborate fiction. If the Pale Watcher wanted to continue the hunt that had consumed my grandfather's life, it would discover that Thorne Calvert was a very different kind of prey. I had advantages my grandfather never possessed: modern technology, better research resources, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and limitations. The homestead's defences could be improved using techniques that hadn't been available in my grandfather's era. Motion sensors with infrared capability, security cameras that recorded to cloud storage, satellite communication systems that would work even in the deepest wilderness. The creature might be ancient and patient, but it had never faced someone who combined traditional protective methods with 21st century technology. I spent 2 weeks reinforcing the house according to military engineering principles, turning my grandfather's fortress into something that could withstand anything short of direct artillery bombardment. The existing iron stakes were supplemented with electronic perimeter sensors. Salt lines were renewed, using industrial-grade equipment that created barriers invisible to normal sight but potentially devastating to supernatural entities. Most importantly, I established secure communication with researchers around the world who took cryptid encounters seriously. Through encrypted channels, I shared my grandfather's documentation with people who possessed similar experiences and had developed their own defensive strategies. For the first time in 40 years, the Pale Watcher would face coordinated opposition rather than isolated victims. But even with all these preparations, I knew the real battle would be psychological. The creature's primary weapon was fear, and my grandfather had ultimately lost because he'd allowed terror to consume his judgment. I couldn't afford to make the same mistake. When the footsteps began circling the house on my third night back at the homestead, I was ready for them. When the familiar voices started calling my name from the darkness, I responded with loudspeakers playing recordings of white noise at frequencies designed to disrupt supernatural manifestations. When shadows began moving wrongly in the security camera feeds, I activated floodlights that turned night into artificial day across the entire property. The Pale Watcher had never encountered prey that fought back using methods it didn't understand. For the first time in its ancient existence, it was facing an opponent who refused to be afraid, who treated the hunt as a tactical problem with technical solutions rather than a supernatural curse that required passive endurance. The voices outside grew more desperate, more insistent, trying combinations of emotional manipulation that would have broken my grandfather's resistance. But I wasn't listening to dead family members pleading for a reunion. I was monitoring audio frequencies, analysing vocal patterns, documenting the creature's psychological toolkit with the cold precision of a scientist studying an interesting but ultimately comprehensible phenomenon. Thorne. The grinding voice that had terrorised my grandfather for decades drifted through the reinforced walls. You cannot hide behind your machines forever. I am patient. I am eternal. I will wait until your batteries die, until your generators fail, until age makes you weak and careless. Then you will join the others who thought themselves clever. But for the first time, uncertainty crept into that inhuman tone. The Pale Watcher was accustomed to victims who cowered behind protective barriers while it wore down their sanity through psychological warfare. It didn't know how to respond to prey that treated it as a research subject rather than an object of terror. I activated the external speakers and responded in a calm, analytical tone that I knew would frustrate a creature that fed on fear. I know what you are now, not some cosmic horror beyond human understanding, but a predator with specific behavioral patterns and measurable limitations. My grandfather documented 40 years of encounters, and I've had time to study your methods. You're impressive, but you're not invincible, and you're definitely not patient enough to outlast modern technology. The footsteps around the house stopped abruptly. For the first time in decades, the Pale Watcher had encountered prey that refused to play by its established rules. The hunt was changing, evolving into something neither of us had experienced before. But this was just the beginning. The creature might be ancient and cunning, but it had never faced someone who approached the supernatural with engineers' pragmatism rather than primitive terror. It had never dealt with an opponent who treated monster hunting as a technical challenge rather than a mystical ordeal. The real war was about to begin, and for the first time in the Calvert family's dark history, we actually had a chance to win it. Outside, the Pale Watcher began testing my defenses with the methodical patience of something that had all the time in the world, and the growing realization that this hunt might not end the way all the others had. But I was ready for a long campaign. I had modern technology, traditional protective methods, worldwide support networks, and most importantly, I had something my grandfather never possessed. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been burned away by knowledge, replaced by cold determination to end a cycle of terror that had consumed too many generations of my family. The Pale Watcher wanted to hunt? Fine. But this time, it would learn what it felt like to be prey. The night was young, and I had work to do.